My name is Kenneth Aleman, and today I'm talking about behaviorism. First and foremost, we have to understand what behaviorism is. And according to Skinner, behaviorism is not the science of human behavior. It is the philosophy of that science, which means that behaviorism is a psychological theory that focuses on behavior that can be observed. However, this theory has two variations: classical conditioning and operant conditioning. The main authors of classical conditioning are John Watson and Ivan Pavlov. Both of them developed experiments with animals. On the one hand, Pavlov with dogs, measuring their salivation when a bell rang before eating, and on the other hand, Watson, who worked with a baby called Little Albert, who at first was not afraid of animals with air such as rats, rabbits, dogs, etc. However, causing unpleasant noise when he was shown the animals again, the baby became afraid, and after some time repeating the experiment constantly, the baby was afraid of the rat without the need for the sun to appear. A classical conditioning simply is a replete of psychological and emotions, behaviors, or responses because outside things happen. And as I mentioned before, Pavlov worked with dogs, but what he learned from the dogs was later translated into classrooms and education for students. The premise was if an animal can learn and be conditioned, then children can be conditioned. This only can work with time. And if you teach animals and you teach human beings to behave in a certain way, to respond in a certain way with an unconditioned response because the stimuli is neutral. So the fact that stimuli is neutral, the stimuli will not prompt the response. The unconditioned response will show, and that is the positive response that you want from students in classrooms. Classical conditioning describes a relationship between stimulus and response. So if we know how to set the required objectives, we will get the right answer. Pavlov identified the fundamental process of associative learning through an experimental that he did with his dogs. So classical conditioning is when two stimuli are paired together many times, so they produce the same result. For example, if a student is bullied at school, he may also learn to associate the school with fear. It could also explain why sometimes some students show a particular dislike of certain subject that continue throughout their academic career. This could happen if a student is humiliated or punished in class by a teacher. That is classical conditioning in a nutshell, the same response. Emotions can be classical conditioning, such as Watson with Little Albert experience showed that this can happen. Little Albert experienced fear. Then teachers want to make sure that classrooms and schools do not become associated with negative emotions such as fear, humiliation, frustration, boredom, shame, despair. And these are often associated with the schools, especially students who are struggling learners and especially students who are dealing with emotion and behaviors. So teachers use shame and just know their teacher do things and they begin to associate the school with these negative emotions. Negative emotions related to learning difficulties. Let's think about when students are frustrated. they are failing, so they have these negative emotions. So let's put ourselves on their position. We be motivated to do something that we could not? Of course not. So how do we deal with that? Here we have some possible answers. Use homework to practice learning. Teach within the zone of proximal development. Provide time in class to begin homework. Because we have to remember that homework is to enforce the subject in class, not a challenge. On the other hand, operant conditioning looks for the reinforcement of the responses according to their stimulus. That means that it looks for the necessary responses to create this relationship in the individual. At the same time, this is the type of learning where the consequences of your behavior shapes your future behaviors. So those consequences may be either a reinforcement or a punishment. Now we will be focusing on the following terminology. A reinforcement is used in order to increase a behavior, and we have two types of reinforcements, positive and negative. On the other hand, a punishment is used to decrease a behavior, deriving positive and negative punishments. For our first example, we have a student who is working diligently on her schoolwork. As a consequence, the teacher can show their appreciation for her hard work by providing positive feedback. Then, in return, the student continues to work hard. So, in this example, we have a stimulus being presented, adding something, which causes behavior happen more often. Therefore, we would call this positive reinforcement. For our next example, we have a good student again, who is working diligently on her course book, and as a consequence, she could remove some of her work, such as dropping a quiz or removing a homework assignment. And this would make her happy and want to continue to work hard. In this example, a stimulus was removed, taking away homework assignment in order to cause the student good behavior to increase, which could be negative reinforcement. For our third example, we have a student who is falling asleep in class. Then, as a consequence, the teacher may get upset and verbally scold the student to wake him up. The misbehavior of sleeping would then stop, and the student would start to focus on class work again. In this example, a stimulus is being presented, the verbal scolding, in order for the misbehavior to happen less often. So we will call this positive punishment. In our last example, we have a student who is using her cell phone during class, and as a consequence for this misbehavior, the teacher could go over the student's desk and confiscate the cell phone. The student's misbehavior will decrease and she can focus on her work again. So, due to a stimulus being taken away, the misbehavior could happen less often, which could be negative punishment. Behaviorism in education. Behaviorism in education can be used to improve the acquisition of knowledge of students, as well as their behavior or attitude in learning process. Due to this, many of these techniques are still used today in formal education and in other less formal areas. The behaviorist theory of education is based on the idea that all behaviors of a person have been learned by a system of reinforcement and punishment that began at birth. Behaviorism adopts a technique based on the idea that a behavior will be repeated more or less frequently in the future because of whether it is rewarded or punished. That means if the person associates with pleasure or pain when doing it. Now we know that a theory is a way to explain a set of facts. Each theory explains different facts. So behavioral learning says that learning is a change in behavior that occurs as a result of experiences. Behavioral learning theory is not concerned with what goes on inside the head. They care nothing of neural networks or cognitive files or schemas, and they are only concerned with behavior and changing behavior and its basis. An example of behaviorism in the classroom could be every teacher usually have a student in class who is difficult to manage and work with. Their behavior is usually hard to control. It can be extra work to get them to pay attention and stop distracting their classmates. It is extremely valuable to learn theories and recognize that there are different methods about how people learn. Now I'm talking about behaviorism in second language acquisition. In the 50s and 60s, it became popular applying behavioral psychology to all types of learning, including language learning. But what is exactly the behavioral second language acquisition? The foreign language learner is the organism whose behavior is being conditioned. The behavior is verbal behavior. The stimulus is what is thought or presented of the foreign language. The response is the learner reactions to the stimulus, and the reinforcement is the teacher approval as well as satisfaction. So behaviorism has some limited usefulness for a second language learning or language acquisition in general, because learning a new language is more difficult than teaching a dog to salivate at the sound of a bell. Here's the problem. If you are only learning by repetition and imitation, it would mean that we can only learn things that are directly taught, that we can only say things that we had heard, and as we know, we can say what we have never heard before, play with the language and invent the language. Now, it is very common to confuse behaviorism with the theory of social learning, because both are developed through the student's conduct. However, there are several aspects that differentiate them. Behaviorism assumes that the learner simply responds passively to their environment, but social learning theory recognizes that the learner plays an active role in the learning. Behaviorism believes that performance and learning are the same thing, and behavior has only been learned if it is used. Social learning theory recognizes a difference between acquisition and performance behavior, but behaviorism pointed that the student's behavior would constantly change in response to new reinforcement. On the one hand, social learning theory recognizes that behaviors can be fixed. In social learning theory research, the majority is done in controlled laboratory experiments. On the other hand, in behaviorism are almost always humans, and its experimental findings are supported by natural observations. Behaviorism centers on external forces being responsible for behaviors. Through a process called conditioning, behaviorism looks for a response to the stimuli offered by the environment. Behaviorism is built around observation. Theories of behaviorism could be tested with experiments, and behaviorism takes a scientific approach to research conclusion. Now, pros of behaviorism. Behaviorism allows learners to move toward acquisition and mastery to standardized procedures and of factual information. Those standards establish what students should know and learn. With behaviorism as the foundational learning theory, the teacher uses designs activities direct the learner reaction to stimuli to reform or weaken behavior through feedback, where standards and objectives require acquisition or mastery procedures or facts, or when there is a skill or procedure to follow. It builds on learners looking for patterns and structure as they accomplish attainable goals. This author reminds her readers is based on the fact that we prefer consistent structures and patterns. Discrimination. Discrimination requires a learner identify whether two items have shared qualities or if a given item belongs to a specific category. Generalization. Generalization identifies common characteristics of specific items in order to formulate a rule. Association. This usually is linking new information to specific applications. And finally, chaining. This uses procedures with prescribed steps. Now, cons. Behaviorism is limited only to what can be observed. Behaviorism does not help to develop intricate internal information. Processing models of cognition by addressing mental processes. Behaviorism ignores the complex mental processes. Language. Behaviorism cannot address the gains of fair language acquisition because it does not deal with the brain's information processing. Behaviorism's basic view of language development centers on language acquisition as a response of stimuli. It has emphasis on memorization and poor relationship with the teacher and classmates. And finally, behavior in the interest of award and not on out of conviction.